A bunch of new trade rumors just came out from Elliotte Friedman's 32 Thoughts podcast, talking about the Ottawa Senators' interest in Seth Jones, more info on Kevin Hayes, and also a very fascinating story about TAGE Thompson almost getting traded years back, and much more. But what are the latest NHL trade rumors? Well, make sure you guys hit that like button, hit that subscribe button if you guys are new. 50% of you guys aren't subscribed. So if you like hockey and trade rumor content, this channel is the place to be. Now let's get straight into it here and go on to NHL Watcher, who detailed a lot of specific things that Elliotte Friedman talked about and what he also said regarding the latest in the NHL. Now, the first trade rumor I want to talk about here is regarding Seth Jones and potentially interest from the Ottawa Senators of all teams, and a crazy bombshell released by Elliotte Friedman. And from this tweet by NHL Watcher, he said this: Elliotte Friedman on 32 Thoughts podcast said, "We've talked about how the Sens have looked at every single possible D-man that you can think of. I think one of the guys they've at least asked about, and I don't think it went anywhere, but I thought was interesting, was one of the guys they asked about was Seth Jones from the Chicago Blackhawks." And this is pretty wild considering everything, and of course the DeBrincat deal we saw in the offseason, Ottawa and Chicago already having interest in each other and already working together on massive deals in the past. But of course, as we see with the injuries on the defense front for Ottawa in the last few weeks and how that's translated, even though they are playing a lot better now, it seems like one of the names that they called into was Seth Jones, even with the monster deal that he has. Now, I really don't think a Seth Jones trade was really all that likely, but when we look at things, with him making $9.5 million with this current huge contract he got from Chicago, you can see at age 28, he would be, I would say, a pretty good fit for what Ottawa needs, but isn't exactly a realistic player to bring on. You see this year so far in 20 games, has 1 goal, 8 assists, 9 points, but has really gotten better in the defensive areas with Chicago, at least recently, and especially this year. But I feel like even though his contract is what it is, it would still take a lot of assets that Ottawa might not want to pay for to actually get a deal like that done. Now, going on to another quote here, and it continues: "As they've dealt with Chicago before in the DeBrincat deal, I think they just called and felt it out. I don't think it's happening. I don't think it's going anywhere, but I heard that on the weekend, they're calling on everybody, and they called in on Seth Jones." Now, what's interesting about this as well is that they were calling in on the weekend, so obviously this was still pretty recently where the Ottawa Senators were going after defensemen, going after anybody on the market here. So even though players like Shabbat have come back and everything recently, they're still looking for sturdier defense, and I think that is still what needs to happen. Even when the Sens were completely healthy, it just felt like they were missing that defensive link that can play great defensively. They have a couple of guys like that, like Artem Zub specifically, but not a great quantity of that. Seth Jones would definitely help, but it's obvious that that might not go there, and Ottawa might not go there. So even though Seth Jones might not be the guy, we get confirmed interest that the Sens are going way out in the market, even again calling Chicago in for Seth Jones, a player that really we don't expect them to trade anytime soon. So it makes it really a good confirmation here that Ottawa is still pretty likely to trade for a D-man. Now let's go on to another story here, and a really fascinating one regarding Kevin Hayes of the Philadelphia Flyers, and if we could potentially see a trade or buyout in the future. And things have gotten rather foggy when it comes to Hayes. Even though he had been the leading scorer for the Flyers and one of their most productive players, things were trending in an interesting direction. And on December 17th, John Tortorella healthy scratched him, being the leading scorer, and took him off the lineup and said, "I can't keep looking by things because we're worried about scoring." And then we go on to Elliotte Friedman's thoughts about this and everything, and going on to what it could potentially look like. As for Kevin Hayes, this is a guy who's on pace for 76 points. I've heard this has been brewing. I've heard Tortorella has told Hayes before that he doesn't like the way he plays without the puck all the time, and then continues saying, "I've looked at Hayes' contract. In his deal, there's about $14 million in bonuses. Almost all of that is paid off. Next year, there's no bonus." I have to tell you, I can't help but look at this contract and say, is this going to be a buyout at the end of the year? And a lot of really interesting information, because on paper, even though Kevin Hayes, yes, is the leading scorer for the Flyers and in some ways has played rather well, you go on to what Tortorella said about, of course, I can't keep looking by things because we're worried about scoring, alluding to the fact that the defensive play from Hayes has been rather suspect, and that's been completely the truth. I mean, there's been games where he's lost the entire team of points in overtime just because of just a lack of great pace or really effort defensively. And I mean, Kevin Hayes could do that in some systems, but when you're playing for John Tortorella, he's not going to let that happen. He's not going to let that fly, and especially the one thing he's not going to let go is laziness, and that seems to be something that has kind of plagued Kevin Hayes' game for such a long time, and especially this season. Even though that scoring has been huge, there is so much more outside of the game than just that, and Hayes has been a great example of just that fact. Now, the fact that Kevin Hayes could actually be bought out is pretty crazy to me, but he makes $7.1 million for the next 3 seasons after this. So for a team trying to acquire him, it would take a lot to be able to get that deal done. But you see at 30 years old, he's, I would say, past his prime, but you can still see the production has been good. You see last year in 48 games, he had 31 points, 10 goals, 21 assists. This year in 31 games has 9 goals, 20 assists, 29 points. But again, that defensive play has just been inconsistent at best throughout his time, not just with Philly, but in his NHL career. And he's a player that, even though in some ways I would say could be worth 7.1, that overall game is absolutely non-existent. And as John Tortorella was kind of alluding, if you're wanting to build a culture and you're wanting to build a culture like Tortorella likes to build culture, Kevin Hayes is just the exact opposite of that. He's the problem in that system because he's the exact opposite of what John Tortorella wants to see in his team. Even though that leading scoring is nice to have, it feels like Kevin Hayes will be out of his way in Philadelphia. And if they're able to strike up a trade at this point, that might be the best way to go about things. But you also just look at the teams with the most cap space right now. You have Arizona, Buffalo, Anaheim, Chicago, Minnesota. I mean, it's gotten to a point where with Hayes, even though that scoring is what he's there to do, that overall game, and again, that laziness, I think is something that you can't really ignore in his game. And it's interesting because we look at the teams with the most cap hit, and a lot of these teams are younger and on the younger side of things. And if I'm an NHL GM, I would absolutely still like to have Hayes on my team in some ways, but do you really want to give that kind of example to younger players, especially if like a team like Buffalo were to trade for Kevin Hayes? Do you really want to have players like Matthew Savoy and other young players coming up in the system looking at Hayes, seeing him get away with the defensive issues that he has, and him kind of rubbing off on him? I don't think that's exactly the type of player that you'd want to have for an up-and-coming team. And to me, he's just kind of a no man's land where maybe he goes off to a bigger, maybe more successful NHL team, but his cap hit is just such a big problem. I mean, even at 50% retained, you still have that term, and that really can be a detriment for a lot of teams. So I was kind of skeptical over if we'd actually see a buyout, but the more I think about it, the more I think that might just be the best thing Philadelphia can do. But now let's go on to another crazy story here, this time though with TAGE THOMPSON of the Buffalo Sabres, and this one really caught my eye, and I think you guys would really be interested in this. And when it comes to Elliotte Friedman, he was talking about this on 32 Thoughts as well, and said this about TAGE THOMPSON, and this is going to be pretty crazy to hear. Someone said to me, they wouldn't say who the team was. There is a team that could have had TAGE THOMPSON a couple of years ago for a 5th round pick and didn't do it. Then Jeff Merrick goes on to say, hang on, 5th rounder when he was with Buffalo or St. Louis? And then Elliotte says with Buffalo when he was struggling. So I would say around 2020, maybe early 2021 perhaps. And then you see it continued. All he said was it's a really good team. He used it as an example of this as such an inexact science sometimes, and how wrong a lot of people were on TAGE THOMPSON. So you get more of a detailed look, and apparently the team that declined TAGE THOMPSON for a 5th rounder was a really good team, and is a really good team. And that to me is just so interesting because you have so many options there between then and now. Is it a team like Pittsburgh? Is it a team like Toronto? Is it a team like friggin' Tampa Bay? There's so many options there, and obviously Buffalo is pretty happy now that they kept onto him. But the fact that he could have been dealt for a fifth back then, just a couple of years ago, most likely, that is pretty crazy to think about. I'd like to know in the comments down below what your guys' guesses are for this. I kind of lean towards a team like maybe Pittsburgh or something. Maybe they didn't want to justify bringing him on. I'm not sure. But again, we know that it was a team that was really, really solid. So a team that's been consistent over these past 2 years. I'm going to say either Pittsburgh or Washington, just as a crazy guess. Also, just for some last trade rumors, let's go over a few more things. Friedman on 32 Thoughts podcast on Marty Necas. He was the guy going to Calgary in the Matthew Tkachuk deal if that got done. He's been much, much better this year. They've always recognized his talent. I think they were disappointed in him last season. And then going on to some more Buffalo Sabres news, Merrick said this. he should actually be a Buffalo Sabre. All the scouts and managers agree that if he's available, Marty Necas was going to be the pick at 8th overall at the last minute, or 8th overall. Then at the last minute, the audible was called, and they decided to go with Casey Mittelstadt instead. So you get a couple of really interesting tidbits. He was almost included in the Matthew Tkachuk deal, which would have been crazy to see going back to Calgary, but we'd obviously see how he play under a coach like Daryl Sutter. It would be a lot to get used to. But then also going on to say the Sabres almost had Marty Necas. Now, I think especially under the last regime with Buffalo, Marty Necas just would not have really worked all too perfectly. But maybe now, by the time that everything has changed now in Buffalo, maybe Necas would finally start to see that stride now. But I just gotta say, it really does suck for Casey Mittelstadt because he legit did have great potential, but it just felt like he was one of the players that was crushed the most under what Buffalo and the mismanagement had going on there. But they almost had Necas, and that would have been crazy to see. Also, one last bit of news that I want to talk about, and I don't even know why I didn't see this before, but Friedman on 32 Thoughts talking about the Flyers and rebuild. I think that they should, and to be honest, I don't think it's impossible. I do believe this has been something that has been discussed for a while now, and I think there's always been a worry that at very high levels, they just don't want to do it. And now I think you can't help but look at it and say, at some point in time, you're going to have to do it. So one last thing there on the Philadelphia Flyers, I've been preaching that they needed to go in the rebuilding direction for countless years now. And especially when they hired John Tortorella and everything, even though I thought it could have made for some short-term relief, potentially, they might not be the worst team in the league. But also at the same time, that rebuild that was screaming in their face to happen, they just never committed to it. And instead of going in that direction, they just had to trade a first for Rasmus Ristolainen. They just needed to trade for Tony DeAngelo. They needed to do all these things that tried to fool everybody into thinking that they're a contender or even just a contender for the playoffs when that just simply was not the case. I mean, the Flyers still have a chance here to really do some great things, but it also has to come with a rebuild of that development. It has to come in a rebuild of the entire franchise, because I don't think they could just rebuild this roster and just be all done with it, because I think there's some massive problems with the way they develop prospects, with how they've been transitioning those guys to the NHL, because that's been a massive problem. I mean, just Nolan Patrick, even though the injury luck has been horrible, of course, they needed to trade him just a couple years after they drafted him 2nd overall, and things like that just cannot happen. But those are some of the latest trade rumors in the NHL right now. Let me know in the comments down below what you guys think about the SENS and Seth Jones story, about the Kevin Hayes story. Do you think he gets bought out? Do you think he gets traded? What do you think about the TAGE Thompson story as well? Do you think it could have been some team like Pittsburgh, some other team? Let us know down below. Who rejected a 5th for TAGE Thompson? Let us know all your thoughts. And of course, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and click on this card right up here for all my trade rumor content right in one playlist. Thank you guys so much for watching. Just a little quick video for you guys. Trying to cover as much as I can, and hopefully you guys did enjoy. And I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.